We weren't supposed to find it. The old trail wasn't marked on any map, not even the detailed ones Cole had printed out before we left. But there it was, half hidden behind a thicket of briars, its entrance framed by ancient trees that seemed to lean in, as if guarding some long-forgotten secret. "Looks like we've found something," Cole said, his voice tinged with excitement. He always was the adventurous one, the leader of our little group of weekend hikers. His enthusiasm was contagious, and before long the four of us, Cole, Jess, Nate, and myself, were pushing through the underbrush, eager to see where the path would lead. The trail was narrow, barely wide enough for us to walk single file. It wound its way deeper into the forest, the trees growing thicker and more twisted the further we went. The sunlight, which had been warm and bright when we first set out, began to fade, choked by the dense canopy overhead. The air grew cooler, and with it came an eerie stillness, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. "Anyone else getting a weird vibe?" Jess asked, glancing around nervously. She was the most cautious of us, always the first to voice concerns when something felt off. "Just your imagination," Cole replied, though I could hear the slight waver in his voice. "It's just an old trail, probably hasn't been used in years." But even as he said it, I knew he didn't believe it. There was something about this place, something ancient, something wrong. We pressed on, the trail growing more treacherous with each step. The ground was uneven, the roots of the trees forming a tangled web beneath our feet. And then, just as the path took a sharp turn, we heard it, a soft, barely audible whisper, carried on the wind. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on us, rustling the leaves in a way that mimicked speech. But as we stood there, frozen in place, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They seemed to come from all around us, from the trees themselves, as if the forest was trying to communicate with us. "What the hell is that?" Nate asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I replied, my heart pounding in my chest. "It sounds like voices." "But there's no one else out here," Jess said, her eyes wide with fear. "Right?" None of us answered. We all knew there was no one else out here. We were miles from the nearest town, deep in the heart of the forest. The realization only made the whispers more unsettling. As we continued down the trail, the whispers grew louder, though we still couldn't make out what they were saying. The language was unfamiliar, ancient, each word sending a shiver down my spine. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches clawing at us as we passed, as if trying to pull us into their twisted embrace. And then, without warning, Nate vanished. One moment he was there, right behind me, and the next he was gone. I didn't hear him scream, didn't see him stumble or fall. It was as if the forest had simply swallowed him whole. "Nate?" I called out, panic rising in my throat. "Nate, where are you?" But there was no answer, only the relentless whispers, now louder, more insistent. They seemed to mock us, laughing at our fear, urging us to keep moving deeper into the forest. "We need to go back," Jess said, her voice trembling. "We need to find Nate and get out of here." But the trail behind us had changed. The way we had come was now a tangled mess of undergrowth and gnarled roots, as if the forest had closed in behind us, trapping us within its grasp. "There's no going back," Cole said, his face pale. "We have to keep moving." Reluctantly, we continued down the trail, the whispers guiding us, pushing us forward. The forest around us seemed to warp and twist, the trees no longer just trees but monstrous, living things, their bark covered in strange symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. The further we went, the more our reality began to unravel. The trees seemed to move on their own, shifting and swaying even when there was no wind. Shadows darted between the trunks, too fast to be animals, too silent to be human, and always the whispers grew louder, their words becoming clearer, though still in that unknown tongue. And then we saw it, the source of the whispers. The trail opened up into a small clearing, at the center of which stood a tree unlike any other. It was massive, its trunk twisted and gnarled, its roots digging deep into the earth like the claws of some ancient beast. The bark was black, charred as if it had been struck by lightning, and the air around it was thick with a sense of malevolence. But what truly terrified me were the faces. Dozens of them, maybe more, were etched into the trunk of the tree. Faces of men, women, and children, their features contorted in agony, their mouths frozen in silent screams, and as I stared at them, I realized with horror that the whispers were coming from the tree itself, from the faces. "God, what is this place?" Jess whispered, tears streaming down her face. It's a trap," Cole said, his voice hollow. "The forest, it lured us here." As if in response, the whispers grew louder, their words no longer just sounds but clear, understandable commands. "Join us. Become one with the forest." I felt a pull, a deep primal urge to walk toward the tree, to press my hands against its bark, to let it consume me as it had consumed the others. I could see the faces more clearly now. One of them was Nate's, his eyes wide with terror, his mouth open in a silent scream. "Don't listen to them," Jess cried, grabbing my arm and pulling me back. "We have to fight it." But it was too late for Cole. I watched in horror as he stepped forward, his eyes glazed over, his body moving as if in a trance. He reached out and touched the tree, and in an instant the bark seemed to come alive, twisting around his hand, pulling him in. He didn't scream. He didn't struggle. He simply disappeared, his body merging with the tree, his face joining the others on the trunk, his eyes wide and unseeing. "Run!" Jess screamed, and I didn't need to be told twice. We turned and fled, crashing through the undergrowth, the whispers now a deafening roar in our ears. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees shifting and warping, the trail disappearing beneath our feet. But somehow we kept moving, driven by sheer terror, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the whispers stopped. We stumbled out of the forest, gasping for breath, the sunlight blinding after the darkness of the trees. We were back on the main trail, the one we had set out on that morning. The old forgotten path was gone, vanished as if it had never existed, but the memory of it remained, burned into my mind. The faces, the whispers, the tree, I knew I would never forget them. We never found Nate. We searched for hours, called for him until our voices were hoarse, but there was no sign of him. Eventually we had to accept the truth: he was gone, claimed by the forest, just like Cole. Jess and I never spoke about what happened after that day. We went our separate ways, each of us trying to forget, trying to move on, but I know I never will, because sometimes, late at night, when the wind is just right, I can still hear the whispers, soft, insistent, calling me back to the forest. And I know that if I listen too closely, I'll find myself on that old, forgotten trail once more, walking deeper into the woods, toward the tree with the faces, until it finally claims me too, and then I'll join the whispers, and my voice will be just one more among the many, calling out to the next group of hikers, luring them into the trap, just as we were lured. Because the forest is alive, and it's always hungry. When Mia and I found the listing for the secluded cabin online, it seemed like the perfect escape. A weekend away from the city, just the two of us, surrounded by nature. The pictures showed a quaint, rustic cabin nestled deep in the woods, far from the noise and chaos of our everyday lives. It was exactly what we needed, a chance to reconnect, to breathe. The drive took longer than we expected. The road twisted and turned through dense forest, the trees closing in on us, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sun. By the time we arrived, dusk was settling in, casting long shadows across the dirt path leading to the cabin. Mia squeezed my hand as we stepped out of the car. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice filled with wonder. I smiled, though I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods were watching us. The cabin stood at the edge of a small clearing, its dark wooden walls blending into the surrounding forest. It looked old, but well kept, with a small porch out front and a stone chimney that promised warmth on cold nights. But there was something about the place that set my nerves on edge, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. "Let's get inside before it gets too dark," I said, grabbing our bags from the trunk. The interior of the cabin was cozy, if a bit musty. A large stone fireplace dominated the living room, with a worn leather couch and a couple of mismatched armchairs arranged around a low coffee table. The walls were lined with shelves filled with old books, their spines cracked and faded. A small kitchen, its appliances outdated but functional, opened up to the living room, and a narrow staircase led up to the loft where we'd be sleeping. "This is perfect," Mia said, her eyes bright with excitement. "We could really use a place like this." "Yeah," I agreed. though the unease still gnawed at the back of my mind. Let's just get settled in. As we unpacked, I noticed something odd, a faint rusty stain on the floor near the fireplace. It looked like dried blood, though I convinced myself it was just an old spill. Still, it made my skin crawl, and I quickly covered it with one of our bags, not wanting to worry Mia. We spent the evening cooking dinner and talking, trying to relax and enjoy the quiet. But as night fell, the cabin took on a different character. The shadows seemed to stretch and deepen, and the silence became oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the wooden beams, or the whisper of the wind through the trees outside. After dinner, we settled on the couch with a bottle of wine, the fire crackling in the hearth. Mia was leaning against me, her head on my shoulder, when we heard it, a faint sound, like the patter of small feet running across the roof. Mia sat up, her brow furrowed. "Did you hear that? Probably just squirrels or something," I said, trying to sound reassuring. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. The sound had been too deliberate, too human. We listened, straining to hear, but the noise didn't come again. Eventually, we brushed it off and went upstairs to bed. But sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the creaks and groans of the old cabin. The wind picked up outside, howling through the trees, and just as I was about to drift off, I heard it again, footsteps, this time louder. Moving across the roof, directly above us. I sat up, my heart racing. Mia stirred beside me, her eyes wide with fear. "What is that?" "I don't know," I whispered, slipping out of bed. "I'll go check." I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and crept downstairs, every nerve on high alert. I unlocked the front door and stepped outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. The forest was silent, the trees standing like dark sentinels against the starless sky. I shone the flashlight around, but saw nothing unusual, just the empty clearing and the impenetrable wall of trees beyond. Then, from somewhere deep in the woods, I heard it, a child's laughter, high-pitched and haunting, echoing through the trees. It sent a chill down my spine, and I backed toward the cabin, my mind racing. Who would be out here, in the middle of nowhere, at this time of night? I quickly locked the door behind me and returned to the bedroom, where Mia was sitting up in bed, clutching the blankets to her chest. "There's someone out there," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean? Who?" "I don't know, but I heard a child laughing." Mia's face paled, and she reached for my hand. "We need to leave now." I nodded, agreeing completely. We hastily threw our belongings into our bags and headed for the door. But as I reached for the knob, I stopped short. The windows, the ones I had been sure were closed, were now wide open, the curtains fluttering in the breeze. "Mia, did you open the windows?" "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't touch them." Something was wrong, very wrong. I could feel it in my bones, a primal fear that told me we were no longer alone in the cabin. I locked the door and backed away, my mind spinning. "We'll wait until morning," I said, trying to sound calm. "It's too dangerous to go out there now." Mia nodded, though I could see the fear in her eyes. We moved to the living room, keeping the fire going as we huddled together on the couch, trying to stay awake. But sleep eventually took us both. I woke in the early hours of the morning to a sound that froze my blood, soft, shuffling footsteps, right behind me. I held my breath, too terrified to move, as the footsteps circled the couch. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it, a small pale hand reaching out toward Mia's face. I jerked awake fully, my heart hammering in my chest. But the hand was gone, vanished into the shadows. I looked around wildly, but there was no one there, only the dying embers of the fire and the oppressive darkness that pressed in from all sides. "We have to leave," I whispered, shaking Mia awake. She nodded, her face ashen, and we grabbed our bags, determined to get out of the cabin before whatever was stalking us made its next move. But as we stepped outside, we realized the true horror of our situation. The forest had changed. The path we had driven in on was gone, replaced by a dense wall of trees that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The cabin was now surrounded by an impenetrable maze of twisted trunks and gnarled branches, their shadows forming grotesque shapes on the ground. "This can't be happening," Mia said, her voice cracking. "We just need to find the road. We'll be okay." We tried to navigate the forest, but every direction we turned led us back to the clearing with the cabin. It was as if the woods themselves were toying with us, keeping us trapped, no matter how far we walked. And then, as we circled back to the cabin for what felt like the 100th time, we saw something that made my blood run cold, figures small and hunched, standing in the shadows just beyond the tree line. They were children, or at least, they looked like children. But their faces were wrong, twisted in unnatural ways, their eyes black and hollow. Mia gasped, clutching my arm, and that's when they started to move, creeping toward us with slow, deliberate steps. Their laughter filled the air, the same eerie, childlike giggling I had heard the night before. But now it was laced with something darker, something malicious. We ran for the cabin, slamming the door behind us. But it was no use. The laughter grew louder, and the walls began to shake, as if the very structure was being torn apart by unseen hands. The windows shattered, and cold wind howled through the cabin, carrying with it the voices of the children, whispering, taunting. "Stay with us. Play with us." Mia was crying now, her face buried in my chest as I tried to think of a way out, but there was none. The cabin was no longer a refuge, it was a trap, and we were caught in it. Then, from the corner of the room, I saw movement, a figure, larger than the children, stepping out of the shadows. It was a man, tall and thin, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. But as he came closer, I saw his eyes, cold, empty voids that seemed to suck the light from the room. "We have to go," I whispered, but Mia didn't move, her body trembling in fear. The man reached out, his hands skeletal, his fingers long and sharp, and as he touched Mia's shoulder, she went limp, collapsing into my arms. "No," I screamed, shaking her, but she didn't respond. The man stepped back, fading into the shadows, and I knew he had taken her. Whatever he was, whatever they were, they'd claimed her soul, leaving behind an empty shell. I was alone. Desperate and terrified, I grabbed the flashlight and bolted for the door, determined to escape, to find help, to do anything, but stay in that cursed place another second. But as I stepped outside, the world shifted again, the trees closing in, the sky darkening, the ground beneath my feet turning to black, swirling mist. I ran, not knowing where I was going, just knowing that I had to get away. But no matter how far I went, the laughter followed me, echoing through the trees, mocking me, pulling me back toward the cabin. And then I saw it, a figure in the distance, running toward me. My heart leaped in my chest as I recognized Mia, her face pale but alive, her eyes wide with fear. "Jack, help me!" she screamed, reaching out for me. I ran toward her, desperate to save her. But as I got closer, I saw the truth. It wasn't Mia, it was one of them. The creature's face twisted into a grotesque grin, and before I could react, it lunged at me, its hands cold and clammy as they wrapped around my throat. I struggled, but it was too strong, and as my vision darkened, I heard the children's voices again, whispering in my ear, "Stay with us, play with us." And then, everything went black. I don't know how long I was unconscious, but when I woke up, I was back in the cabin, alone. The fire was out, the windows were boarded up, and the door was locked from the outside. I tried to open it, to break it down, but it was no use. I was trapped. The laughter had stopped, but the silence was worse. It pressed in on me, suffocating, and I knew there was no escape. The forest had claimed us, just like it had claimed the family before us, and the cabin would never let us leave. Now I sit here, alone in the dark, waiting for them to come for me. I know they will, eventually. And when they do, I'll join the others, forever trapped in this place, my soul lost to the shadows in the pines. Because in the end, the forest always gets what it wants, and this time it wanted us. We'd all heard the stories. The locals called it the Whispering Wood, a forest that had supposedly swallowed whole villages and travelers alike. There were rumors of voices in the dark, of people who ventured in and never returned. But we were young, cocky, and desperate for an escape from the grind of our daily lives. So when Alex suggested a weekend camping trip deep in those very woods, we laughed off the warnings. It was just a legend, we told ourselves, a ghost story to scare kids. There were 4 of us. Alex, the ringleader who never backed down from a challenge, Julie, always eager for an adventure, Sam, the skeptic who needed to see everything with his own eyes, and me, Tom, the one who usually kept us grounded, though this time even I couldn't resist the allure of a weekend away. We set out early, the sun barely cresting over the horizon, our backpacks heavy with supplies. The deeper we hiked into the forest, the quieter it became. The usual sounds of wildlife faded, replaced by an oppressive silence that settled over us like a shroud. The trees towered above, their gnarled branches intertwining to blot out the sky, casting long, twisted shadows on the forest floor. By the time we found a clearing suitable for our campsite, the sun was already dipping low, casting the woods in an eerie golden light. We set up our tents, built a fire, and settled in for the night, our laughter echoing through the trees as we told stories and roasted marshmallows. But as the darkness closed in around us, the mood shifted. The fire's warmth seemed to retreat, leaving a chill in the air that hadn't been there before. It was then that we first heard the whispers. At first, it was so faint that I thought I'd imagined it. A soft murmur like the rustle of leaves, just on the edge of hearing. I glanced at the others, but they didn't seem to notice, so I pushed the thought aside. It was probably just the wind, I told myself. But as the night wore on, the whispers grew louder. They seemed to circle our campsite, coming from all directions at once. Julie was the first to mention it. "Do you guys hear that?" she asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "Hear what?" Sam replied, poking the fire with a stick, the flames crackling in response. "The whispers," she said, her eyes darting to the darkened tree line. "It's like voices." Alex laughed, though it sounded forced. "It's just the wind, Jules. We're in the middle of nowhere. Of course it's going to sound creepy." But Julie wasn't convinced, and neither was I. The whispers were becoming clearer, more distinct, as if they were forming words. It was hard to make out, but I could swear I heard something like, "Leave before it's too late." We tried to ignore it, forcing ourselves to focus on the warmth of the fire and the comfort of each other's company. But the whispers wouldn't be silenced. They grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like they were right next to us, just beyond the flickering light of the flames. "Maybe we should call it a night," I suggested, trying to keep the unease out of my voice. "We've got a long hike back tomorrow." The others agreed, relieved to have an excuse to retreat to the safety of our tents. We doused the fire, the darkness rushing in to fill the void, and zipped ourselves into our sleeping bags, trying to block out the unsettling sounds that continued to whisper through the trees. I don't know how long I lay there, staring up at the dark canvas of the tent, listening to the whispers that seemed to seep through the very fabric. They were clearer now, forming words that I could almost understand, but not quite. It was maddening, like trying to grasp a thought just out of reach. At some point I must have drifted off, because the next thing I knew I was jolted awake by a scream. It was Julie. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag, heart pounding, and rushed outside. The campfire was dead, the clearing lit only by the pale light of the moon. Julie stood in the middle of the campsite, her face pale, eyes wide with terror. "Sam's gone," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He's just gone." "What do you mean gone?" Alex demanded, stumbling out of his tent. "He was right here." But Julie was right. Sam's tent was empty, his sleeping bag tossed aside as if he'd left in a hurry. Panic surged through me as I scanned the surrounding woods, the shadows deep and impenetrable. "Sam!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the trees. There was no response, just the whispers, louder now, swirling around us like a malevolent wind. We searched the campsite, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. "What the hell is going on?" Alex muttered, his bravado crumbling. "This isn't funny, Sam." But Sam didn't answer, and the longer we stood there, the more I realized he wasn't going to. We gathered in the center of the campsite, huddled together like frightened animals. The whispers were relentless now, their words clear and unmistakable. Leave before it's too late. We need to get out of here, Julie said, her voice barely above a whisper. Now. But as we prepared to leave, something stopped us. Sam's voice calling out from the darkness. Wait, he said, his voice calm, almost soothing. I'm here. We spun around, searching for him, but the voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Sam, where are you? Alex shouted, his voice cracking with fear. I'm here, the voice repeated, closer now. I'm fine, just come to me. Julie's face drained of color. That's not Sam, she whispered, her eyes wide with horror. That's not him. What are you talking about? Alex snapped, though I could hear the fear in his voice. It doesn't sound right, Julie insisted. It's like something pretending to be him. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. She was right. The voice was off, just slightly, but enough to send a chill down my spine. It was too smooth, too controlled, like someone imitating Sam's voice but not quite getting it right. Come on, the voice urged, almost pleading now. Don't you want to find me? We're leaving, I said, my voice shaking. We're not playing whatever game this is. But as we turned to gather our things, the whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices all speaking at once, overwhelming, suffocating. They were in our heads, in our bones, urging us to stay, to give in. And then we saw him. Sam stepped out from the trees, his face illuminated by the pale moonlight. But it wasn't Sam. His eyes were dark, empty pits, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. His mouth twisted into a grotesque smile as he stepped closer, the air around him growing colder with each step. Don't you want to stay? He asked, his voice echoing with 100 others, layered and discordant. We can be together, forever. We backed away, the horror of what we were seeing paralyzing us. This wasn't Sam. This was something wearing his skin, something old and malevolent, something that had been waiting for us in the dark. We have to go, Julie whispered, her voice trembling with fear. Now. But it was too late. The thing that had been Sam moved faster than we could react, closing the distance between us in an instant. It grabbed Alex, its hands like claws, pulling him into a cold, suffocating embrace. Help me, Alex screamed, but there was nothing we could do. The whispers grew deafening, drowning out his cries as the darkness closed in around him, swallowing him whole. Julie and I ran, the forest a blur of shadows and fear. The whispers chased us, hounding our every step, urging us to stop, to give in. But we didn't. We couldn't. We ran until our lungs burned, until the trees began to thin, and the first light of dawn broke through the canopy. But even then the whispers didn't stop. They echoed in our minds, a constant reminder of what we'd left behind. We stumbled out of the woods, collapsing onto the side of the road, gasping for breath. Julie was crying, her body shaking with sobs. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her it was over. But the truth was I wasn't sure it ever would be. We were found by a passing car, the driver taking one look at our pale, terrified faces and calling the police. We tried to explain what had happened, but our story was met with disbelief. Sam and Alex were never found, their disappearances chalked up to the dangers of the wilderness. But Julie and I knew the truth. We knew what we'd seen, what we'd heard. The forest had taken them, twisted them into something else, something that still whispered to us in the dead of night. And as I sit here, writing this, I can still hear those whispers, faint but insistent, calling me back to the woods, back to the darkness. Come back, they say. It's not too late. But I know better. I know what waits for me there. So I'll ignore the whispers, try to drown them out with the noise of the city, the company of others. But deep down I know that they'll never stop, and I'll never be free.